We're going to be continuing the conversation with a roundtable with my post colleagues about how other countries are racing ahead in AI. Gerrit Vynck is a San Francisco-based reporter writing about artificial intelligence, and Eva Do is a tech policy reporter based in DC. Gerrit, Eva, welcome.
Thanks. Thanks for having us here.
So Eva, we just heard from Kai-Fu about how the US is still ahead in the AI race, but China is not far behind. You spent nearly a decade in the Greater China region watching tech developments there. Give us a reality check. How is China doing?
Yes, thanks so much, Young-hee. So if we go back a few years, the year 2017 was kind of a key year in China's AI development. And if we think about what was happening then, Google had just rolled out something called AlphaGo, which could beat the world's best players at this Chinese strategy game, Go. That's one of the world's hardest games to play. And this was, a totally obscure thing, but to people in the industry, what it showed is this technology has reached another level of sophistication. And what we saw in China in year 2017 is they put out a national plan, sort of similar to Biden's executive order that came recently, where they laid out a timeline where by the year 2025, next year, China's goal is to make major breakthroughs in AI. And by the year 2030, their goal is to be a world leader in AI, if not the world leader in AI. And so sort of China putting that plan out there, it didn't get a lot of public attention at the time, but there was a lot of policymakers took notice. And what we've seen is a lot of efforts by the US government since then to flatten China's curve, to make sure that doesn't happen, that China is not the AI leader by 2030. And so as Kai-Fu, your interview with Kai-Fu showed, China is trying its hardest to catch up, to narrow the gap. And in some ways, it has caught up in some specific areas. Like I think Alibaba's large language model recently was able to perform better than Meta's in some things like math and coding. But sort of in general, it's probably unlikely that China is going to actually catch up to the US in AI anytime soon, probably mostly because the US government is intent on making sure that doesn't happen.
Right, so Kai-Fu was a little too optimistic there. Gerrit, you've been watching and writing very closely about the tech Cold War between the US and China. Kai-Fu talked a little bit about some of the things that worries him. Let's talk about the military applications of AI. What are the implications of that, and how are the US companies preparing?
Yeah, I think part of the reason behind China's interest in becoming an AI leader, and also some of the official justification from the US for pretty drastic response, such as the export restrictions that Eva was talking about, are coming from a concern that AI has huge implications for the battlefield, for warfare, something that we're going to all hear about a little bit later in the programming in more detail. But I think both countries really see that the technology, as it gets better, will become a bigger part of both military planning. So being able to know, where you need to move things around in, before a war, to prepare for a war, during a war, at the tactical level, at the big picture strategic level. The AI is already being used in the military for things like planning when you need to replace certain parts. Before we had a big list, okay, this screw would come undone after 18,000 flight hours, for example. And you really only know that from when the screw falls off and maybe the plane breaks apart. But now they're applying machine learning and AI algorithms to try to predict these things, move all the parts, so sort of fix logistics. And then I think as well, both countries are seeing that in the future they want to have a lot more machines, airplanes, submersibles, ships out, especially when you're looking at the Pacific, which is the largest possible place that you could have a conflict. It's a place where you're going to need to have thousands or tens of thousands of machines to really be able to know what's going on and to cover that space really well. And AI is integral to that, because you can't have 15,000 F-35 fighter pilots. You just can't train that many people, and you can't build that many very, very expensive planes. But you can have 15,000 cheaper, smaller drones that maybe you're not as worried about them getting damaged or shot down. And so both countries are really investing in this for the military applications as well.
And Eva, you've written a lot about drones and how China is preparing for this scenario. What can you tell us about developments there in terms of military AI applications in China?
Yeah, well, China has been very interested, as Gerrit mentioned, in AI applications. I think that's sort of the quiet part that people don't always say aloud, and why governments are so interested in these technologies now. Because there is this mentality now, we're almost entering a new Cold War, that there is a breakdown in trust, and if you don't know exactly what your adversary is going to do, then you have to make all sorts of preparations on your own end.
Gerrit, so the US and China are racing ahead, but they're not the only ones trying to lead in AI. Countries like France and the UK are also vying to be the top leader in AI. Talk to us a little bit about the developments in Europe. Has the tough regulations there hurt some of the companies to innovate?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely this idea that Europe has really strict regulations, and that's one of the reasons why they don't necessarily have, a Google or an Amazon, or in the case of China, Alibaba that sort of dominates the world with their power. I think the AI regulation specifically in Europe is quite new, and it's still being sorted out. So I don't think we can necessarily say that strict AI regulation is holding back Europe's AI industry. I think there's bigger sort of economic or kind of, commercial reasons behind that, and also the fact that the big tech companies have really locked down the market for so many years and made it difficult for new startups, whether they're in Europe or here in the US, to come up and break their power. But one company in France, Mistral AI, is really interesting. I mean, they've claimed to be able to come up with really, really great AI models that do rival some of the very expensive ones being built by US companies in their capability for a lot less money. And they're also now raising serious amounts of money. And because they have sort of the support of the European governments behind them, who are very interested both politically and economically in having their own national champions, I do think that we definitely, US companies shouldn't count out European competition at all.
And Eva, I mean, Washington has been very wary about China's tech ambitions, and it hasn't necessarily been very fast in terms of regulating the AI industry. So what do you foresee going forward in terms of the regulation front in the US?
Well, this is one of the few areas of policy in DC now where there is sort of a bipartisan consensus. And so it's kind of interesting that in election year, we can kind of predict where policy is going to be a year from now, regardless of what happens in this election, which is, like both parties' stances differ in some ways, but in general, both parties agree that, this rivalry with China is sort of going to be a major part of foreign policy going forward for at least some years, maybe even decades. And so that means probably continued export restrictions for the most advanced technologies in the US, such as advanced semiconductors, AI algorithms towards China.
We've written about this already, but Silicon Valley is courting a lot of investors when it comes to AI from the Middle East, and the Biden administration is pushing this agenda. What's the agenda there?
Yeah, that is also an interesting part of this US-China rivalry, that it spreads beyond the two countries, and we are seeing it play out in a number of regions of the world, the Middle East one of them, which our colleagues recently wrote about. In that, on the back end of AI systems is an enormous amount of data, and that's incredibly valuable to the governments, it's incredibly valuable to companies, and there's immense competition about which companies of which nationalities are involved in these projects. And US companies like IBM have been competing with Chinese companies like Huawei, and this has been an ongoing competition that now in the new AI generation of technology is ongoing.
Final question in a minute or less. What is the biggest unanswered question for you about AI? And let's start with Gerrit.
I think, Kai-Fu Lee was saying that there's almost this assumption that every year, every 6 months, AI will just get exponentially smarter, and 6 months from now, OpenAI will come up with something that blows away what we have now, and we'll have to reevaluate all of our assumptions. And I'm not sure that's actually true. And so I think the biggest question is whether AI will continue to advance at this rate, or whether it starts to slow down in terms of that big step change and kind of plateau, and we'll need some other kind of AI technology to increase that innovation.
Eva?
Yeah, that's a great point. I would add on to that, I'm quite curious. I'm a tech policy reporter, and so from the policy aspect, I'm very curious if sort of this industrial policy swing that the US is taking, how it's going to turn out. Because for many years, the US took a very light regulatory hand in industries like advanced technologies, and now it's in competition, and China is taking more control in areas like AI. So it would be interesting to see how that turns out.
Well, we'll definitely continue to follow this story very closely. I'm afraid we're out of time. Gerrit, Eva, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.